For today's leadership video, I'm filming outside the famed courthouse in downtown Waxahachie. This is the Ellis County Courthouse. The county courthouse is just emblematic of the American jurisprudence world, where the view in America is that you settle your disputes with your neighbors, if it's a civil matter, or you settle the disputes with your neighbors in terms of criminal trial by going through a process. Police are involved, investigators are involved, prosecuting attorneys, defense attorneys. You have a right to certain level of criminal defense. You have a right to a certain type of trial, including by peers to be heard, have your trial heard by your peers, a trial by jury. And all of these things are an intent to keep you from, or me from, taking the law into my own hands. That a lawless society has a situation where this type of thing is skipped, and we had right to being the judge and jury and executioner in a situation where we feel we've been wronged or someone else has been wronged. Jesus is traveling in a certain region in Samaria, and they're ultimately now starting to head towards his final destiny of the city of Jerusalem and the cross. And when they get to Samaria, there's this interesting encounter where Jesus's disciples notice that the local citizens reject his presence there. They run him out of town. And the disciples, a couple of the disciples come to Jesus and they ask something that is really striking. They ask something where they say to Jesus, "Jesus, this group has unjustly rejected you. Would you like for us to call fire and brimstone out of heaven and destroy the whole lot of them?" And this is a really surprising statement. The desire of these two disciples to suddenly wipe out the Samaritan community in an instant, as if they are now suddenly the final authority, or asking Jesus for final authority to execute divine judgment on them. In doing so, they are basically taking on the role of God there, and Jesus rebukes them, and he basically shuts that all down, that their desire for instantaneous justice is misplaced. And it's misplaced probably for a couple of reasons. Number one is that there is a redemptive aspect in Samaria later on. As you know, the church in Acts chapter 8 springs to life in Samaria. Philip goes to Samaria. He presents the gospel of Jesus Christ. They believe. Could it be that some of the people that believe in this moment in Acts chapter 8 would have been victims of this divine vigilante justice, whatever you want to call it, by the disciples to invoke God and their anger over their sense of injustice toward Jesus? They want to invoke fire and brimstone out of heaven. Could they have even destroyed some of the individuals that later become pillars in the early church, individuals they would later come and pray with and sing songs with and things like that? The second thing that we see here, and this involves an aspect of spiritual leadership, that when injustice happens, when there's a sense that this situation is unjust or that situation is unjust, this person's acted unjustly, is that there's a temptation for us to take on authority that's not our own. And we'll see this even in a home, where parents of multiple kids will have to say to the oldest child, "Let me parent." Because what will happen is that the younger sibling or younger siblings will do something, and the oldest sibling will suddenly start to take on, the 10-year-old's now going to parent the 7-year-old, and to parent them at a level that is well beyond just an older sibling trying to encourage a younger sibling. And a parent will have to say to this older sibling, "Let me parent. You're taking on authority that's not your own." And I think that's what happens here, is that Jesus rebukes his disciples. They're trying to take on authority that is not theirs. So one of the battles in the realm of spiritual leadership is this issue of taking on authority that's not properly ours. We'll see this in a church setting, where a church member will, on their own authority, try to address a situation that really belongs either with the elders of the church, the pastor, the deacons of a church, however the church is structured. And in spiritual leadership, when someone takes authority that's not theirs, we get in trouble. For instance, if someone in the courtroom today just randomly stood up and said, "I don't care what the judge says or the jury or what any of these attorneys say, this is what I think should happen." and they grab the defendant and they say he's released, or they grab the defendant and say I'm taking him to jail right now. He gets life in prison. And hopefully immediately the bailiff would intervene because this person would have taken authority to themselves that's not theirs. But we see this in more subtle places within the home. As I mentioned, sometimes a younger sibling is being parented by an older sibling in such a way that it's actually detrimental to the unity of the entire family, and it's not good for the relation between the two of them, and the younger sibling's not going to hear them out anyway. It's not going to be productive. We see this in church, as I mentioned, where individuals will take on authority that's not theirs. I see it in a workplace. I've seen it in the workplace where individuals will take on authority that's not theirs. To say to another employee, you shouldn't have a job, you need to be fired, you shouldn't be here, to get really angry at them. And in doing so, they circumvent the process that's built into that workplace where there's a boss, there's an actual authority in that workplace, and individuals, without using that process that is understood and maybe even written out in an employee handbook, takes on the process themselves, circumventing the whole process, and in doing so actually doesn't help anything. With the desire to help, they're actually causing more harm than good by taking authority that is not theirs, much like the disciples did on that day to say to Jesus, hey, do you want us to take on this task of bringing judgment in this case? And Jesus' response isn't, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that. I'm so glad you guys are here to help me think more clearly on this. No, instead Jesus rebukes them because they've stepped into a realm that's not theirs. And so we'll see this in church, workplace, family. I see it in sports. And in the realm of spiritual leadership, a critical aspect of spiritual leadership is knowing our role. So if you're a church member, there's a role that you're to be playing. If you're a deacon at a church, there's a role that you should be playing. When deacons overstep that role, disunity happens. If you're a pastor of a church, there's a role you're to be playing. You have authority, but not final and ultimate authority with no other voice. And we have definitely seen that in churches where a pastor, very authoritarian, ultimately destroys the church instead of building it up because they use their pastoral role as authoritarian and not as leading. And so in all of this, what we want to acknowledge is that God ultimately is the sovereign, that any leadership we exhibit is an extension of His created work in us, our image bearing, and our understanding of the divine hierarchy and roles in the realm we're in the workplace, in the home, in the church, on a baseball field, whatever it might be. And then to work within those defined spaces to build up the people around us, maybe even confront the people around us in the right circumstances, but to have the right people do that. And what destroys a leadership structure is with individuals within the structure claim authority that's not theirs. So that's our devotional for this week, having a proper understanding of authority within the realm of leadership in whatever group we're in.